Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. As you know, we cover some of the most interesting live trials and legal cases in the country today, and I'm so happy you're joining us because we have a really full rundown, and I want to talk to you about all of the cases that we're covering right now. Let's start off with a case that many of you have probably heard. We have an update in the Vanderbilt rape case. For anybody who's following this, 4 former Vanderbilt University players were charged with raping a girl in a dorm room back in 2013. Now, in separate trials, Brandon Vandenberg, Corey Beatty, and Brandon Banks were all convicted in connection with the rape, and they're currently serving time in Tennessee prisons. Their appeals are pending. But what do we have today? Well, now we have the 4th player, Jobian Tip McKenzie. You may remember that anybody who followed this case, that he cooperated with prosecutors and testified previously against his former teammates. There was no evidence that we know of as yet that McKenzie actually touched the victim, but he testified in open court that he was there, that he watched this physical and sexual assault, and now he's on court. Now he's potentially on trial. What's going to happen today? He will appear in court today, but we really don't know what the status of the case is. We believe there might be a plea deal because he cooperated with prosecutors. Then again, he may opt to go for a trial. We're going to cover that here on Law and Crime. You don't want to miss anything. As soon as we have a live feed in that case or we have an update in that, we'll make sure to let you know. But we want to switch gears right now because I want to talk about our main case of the program. This case, this is straight out of Breaking Bad. Okay, you ready? This is out of Massachusetts. A reverend, you heard me right, a reverend named Shawn Johnson is on trial for allegedly attempting to murder a high schooler by shooting him execution style in the back of the head in 2015. According to that victim, Luis Rodriguez, who testified earlier in this case, Mr. Harrison, who was a dean in his high school, befriended him one day. And what did he do? Well, he alleges that he brought him into the illicit world of the drug trade, that he was helping sell marijuana for this Reverend Harrison. Now, the prosecution argues that Reverend Harrison lured Rodriguez out one night and shot him due to decreased weed sales. So he's facing a number of charges right now, including armed assault with intent to murder. This shooting was captured on surveillance footage. Now, if you look at the footage of it, it's kind of hard to tell who's who, but to capture a shooting on surveillance footage is pretty incredible. Now, as you can imagine, Mr. Harrison, Reverend Harrison, is denying all of this. He says he's not a gang member. He's the Reverend. He's the Rev. Those are his words. We are in day 3 of this case, so we apologize to you right now that we weren't able to get into this case earlier, but we are going to recap this case as much as we can. We will update you about anything that's happening, and the way we might do that, we have a short report summarizing what you might have missed in this case so far. Take a look. Okay, everybody, so welcome back. A little issue there with our report about the Shawn Harrison case. Again, this reverend who's on trial for attempted murder by shooting a high school student. Pretty incredible stuff. We're going to be covering that here. That's our main trial here on Law and Crime. But let's take a step back. For anybody who's been following us here on the Law and Crime Network or Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, you know we've been covering, we've been monitoring, and we've been following the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. I'll tell you what, this is not even alleged. He is a convicted serial killer who was previously on trial. We covered it here on Law and Crime. He was on trial for killing 2 women and abducting and raping a 3rd. Last week, it was his sentencing hearing. He faced the potential of the death penalty because of those aggravated murder charges. So that same jury that convicted him, and anybody who followed this case, the police found the decomposed bodies of Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley in his house. And the way police were lured to that house is because Jane Doe, this woman who was kidnapped and raped by him repeatedly, was able to call 911. The police came and they saw this house of horrors. Well, the jury came back with a verdict in terms of life or death. Did they sentence him to life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty? Take a look. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Grate was recommended by the jury to the death penalty. Again, for anybody following it here on Law and Crime or Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, you can go to lawandcrime.com to learn a little bit more about it. But Shawn Grate, that convicted serial killer, now faces the potential of the death penalty. But let's learn a little bit more about that verdict. Again, joining me right now is a very special guest, Law and Crime trial analyst, Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, great to see you.
Jesse, always good to see you. Excuse me.
So what happens now? So the jury said we think he should be sentenced to death, but that doesn't mean he necessarily could be sentenced to death. What happens?
The judge gets to decide whether or not to accept the recommendation of the jury. And in this case, Jesse, let's just be real for a minute. Why wouldn't a judge accept the recommendation? If ever there was a case that called for the death penalty, it's this one. This is the case that reminded me of Jeffrey Dahmer, in that you have somebody who just keeps killing people and then keeping them in his house indefinitely. There's really something wrong with this person. There's no redemption to be had here. Let's put him on death row and do justice for these victims.
He pled guilty to 15 of the 23 charges in the middle of the trial. Then he confessed to the murders, the kidnappings, the rapes. He confessed to so much of these crimes already. Can't say I was surprised that he was convicted, but his defense tried to put forward a case and say, listen, this guy suffers from a number of mental defects and diseases. You have to look at his childhood, a really traumatic childhood. That didn't hold any sway for the jury, though, did it?
You know, this is not the kind of case where it's going to, you can't look at 12 people in the eyes and say, you know, he had a tough time growing up. Daddy was really hard on him. Mommy was really hard on him. So let's give him a pass for raping and murdering multiple people. It just doesn't fly. It didn't fly here. This, like I said, there's no redemptive value in this person. Let's lock him up and put him on death row.
Well, Jonna, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to analyze this case a little bit further. We're going to play the testimony of Dr. John Fabian. This is the person brought forward by the defense to say Shawn Grate suffered from serious mental conditions, and perhaps, jury, you shouldn't sentence him to death but life in prison. Well, clearly that didn't work, but we're going to play that for you. You can learn a little bit more about the defendant. And when we come back, we're also going to talk about Reverend Shawn Harrison. Excuse me. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We are covering a lot here. As you know, we cover the most interesting live trials in the country today. And guess what? We are going to be live in a major trial. This one's out of Massachusetts. It's about a reverend named Shawn Harrison, who is currently on trial for allegedly attempting to murder a high schooler by shooting him execution-style in the back of the head in 2015. It's alleged that Mr. Harrison was operating an illegal drug trade, and he enlisted the help of Luis Rodriguez, the victim, to help sell some of those drugs. And apparently that drug was marijuana, and according to the prosecution, he was upset at Mr. Rodriguez because of decreased weed sales. So what did he do? Shot him in the back of the head. That's the prosecution's theory. Now, Mr. Rodriguez survived the shooting, and he testified earlier in the case. This is day 3. We're waiting for that live feed. As soon as we have it, we'll make sure to go into that case. But we want to step back for a second and recap another case that we've been covering here on Law and Crime. This is the case of Shawn Grate out of Ohio, that convicted serial killer, a man who was convicted of killing 2 women, Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley, as well as Stacey Hicks. She's also been referred to as Stacey Hicks. He also was convicted in the rape of Miss Hicks, and he was also convicted in the kidnapping and rape of a woman who's only been identified as Jane Doe. That same jury that convicted him across the board had to determine what his punishment would be. And as we told you before our last break, they came back, they recommend the death penalty. But that's not the end of the story here, because we wanted to fully analyze Mr. Grate. This is a convicted serial killer. What was going on in his mind? What was his upbringing like? The defense tried to put evidence forward from different witnesses to try to understand what his upbringing was like. Who was he? Perhaps if the jury had a better understanding of who this man is, they wouldn't sentence him to death. And they tried to say he suffered from serious mental conditions and he couldn't control his actions, so he's not so blameworthy that he should receive the death penalty. Well, that didn't work, but we're going to play you a little bit right now of the testimony of Dr. John Fabian. He was brought forward by the defense. Listen to what he says about the relationship between Mr. Grate and his mother. And you can always tell the relationship between somebody and their mother really may explain a lot of things. Take a look. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. You were just listening to the testimony of Dr. John Fabian, a key witness in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Shawn Grate was a convicted serial killer. He was on trial previously for killing 2 women and also abducting and raping a third. He was found guilty across the board. That same jury that convicted him then had to decide what his punishment should be. And they could have either chose life in prison without the possibility of parole, a certain number of years in prison, or they could have even found the death penalty. Well, guess what? They came back and said, in light of all of what we've seen, we recommend the death penalty. So who's Dr. John Fabian? Well, Dr. John Fabian is somebody that was called forward by the defense to in the penalty phase to say, listen, jury, don't be so quick to say death penalty. Let's learn a little bit more about Shawn Grate, what his childhood was like, what does he suffer from mentally, and this is not somebody who's deserving of the ultimate punishment. Now, again, that didn't really work, but it's interesting to understand a little bit more about the defense's case, and more importantly, to try to get into the mind of this person, Shawn Grate. Let's talk a little bit more about it with Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. So what did we learn about this serial killer, Shawn Grate, from Dr. John Fabian?
Well, let me start here, because I don't want to be too harsh on the defense counsel here. They did what defense counsel must do, and that is to try to mitigate the gravity of these disgusting and horrible crimes the only way they can, and that is by bringing on an expert to say, wait a minute, we have somebody, and I'll quote him, who said, Dr. Fabian, his brain's not working right. So that was the underlying theme. Don't punish him because his brain doesn't work like our brains work. The problem with that is you can try to garner sympathy with the jury, but in a case like this where you have rapes and murders and kidnapping, you would need a lot more than just simply an expert saying, Mom gave him a hard time, his brain's not working right, he smokes pot way too much, in order to save him from the death penalty. And frankly, I think the jury got this one right.
Well, what he said, that he suffers from neurological impairments. You know, he has all these kinds of disorders that he was diagnosed with. But you're saying it's just not severe enough to warrant in the eyes of a jury. What, in your experience, have you seen those kinds of mental diseases where a jury comes back and says, you know what, as heinous as this crime is, we can't go forward with the death penalty?
You know, where it comes up the most, honestly, like, and I didn't mean to be flippant when I said, you know, mommy gave him a hard time, daddy gave him a hard time, but in cases where somebody has been actually abused for years and years and years, typically a physical abuse, a sexual abuse, then and only then do I see juries having some sort of sympathy. But if you're, I mean, this expert's saying he sits around and smokes pot, he had a concussion, he didn't have a good relationship, he's got ADHD, which half the planet has, so don't even go there with me, expert, if I were talking with him. So I just don't think it was enough in this case. And when you look at the egregiousness, now we were spared having to see the video of this man actually raping one of his victims, thankfully, but he's just beyond repair, in my opinion.
And we can't forget anybody who was following this case about Shawn Grate. He had a pattern where he sought out vulnerable women, sometimes mentally impaired women, people who needed his help. Even Stacy Stanley, one of his victims, one of the decomposed bodies that was found at his house, was a mother whose car broke down, and he was trying to help her replace a tire. And this pattern of seeking out women who needed his help or who were vulnerable didn't look good in the eyes of the jury. But we did learn more about Shawn Grate, this serial killer, from somebody who knew him very well, his sister, Barbara Charter. She testified earlier in this case last week, talking about what Grate was like as a kid. Take a look. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, your host here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. We're learning a little bit more about the background, the history, the upbringing of a I shouldn't even say accused anymore, a convicted serial killer named Shawn Grate out of Ohio. We covered his entire trial here when he was on trial for the murders of 2 women and the abduction and rape of a third. He was found guilty across the board. We also covered his sentencing hearing, which is that clip was just from when that same jury had to determine whether or not he should be found eligible for the death penalty or whether life in prison is the appropriate punishment. Well, they came back and recommended the death penalty. That was the testimony of Barbara Charter, his sister. Now, what did we learn? Let's talk a little bit more about it with Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. Now, Jonna, you're a great attorney, but I know you're not a psychotherapist, a psychoanalyst, but let's analyze this guy a little bit. You handle criminal defendants. You see these people in general. You study this. Relationship between his mother, and a relationship between a mother is always an interesting perspective between a son and a mother. They had a toxic relationship. It was, as you heard from his sister, it was about control. And Dr. John Fabian, who was on the stand, also said he was emotionally neglected by his mother. When you hear that, what does it tell you about how he would turn out?
Well, it says a couple of things to me. On the one hand, my response is, I represent a lot of, say, single mothers who raise healthy boys and girls who don't grow up to be mass murderers and rapists, so for starters. But I understand, the relationship between a boy and his mother, any child and his or her mother, is very important, and it can be very formative. But again, in this case, and it's no accident then that his crimes are really geared toward women, right? If he has this kind of tumultuous relationship with his own mother. But that does not give him a pass. And let's remember one other thing. We are here in the sentencing phase because you have a guy who basically confessed to more crimes than he was tried for. And if the prosecution thought this was an appropriate case for life in prison without parole, we wouldn't have had a trial. We wouldn't be having a sentencing. They would have accepted his plea, and then he'd already be behind bars serving the rest of his life. The prosecution didn't want that, and they didn't want that for a reason. So they presented these heinous crimes to a jury to let the jury decide, and the jury is not swayed by this testimony that he had a rough upbringing.
It's funny because it's interesting to listen to, but at the same point, you made a great point. Everybody has an upbringing. Everybody goes through things. And that brings me to the next clip I want to play for you. Again, this is the continuation of Barbara Charter, the sister of Shawn Grate, the sister of this serial killer. And listen very carefully to a key point that the prosecution makes. Listen very carefully, and this might have been what convinced them at the end of the day that all this background stuff about Shawn Grate really doesn't matter. Take a look. There was some interesting back and forth with a key witness there in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Shawn Grate case. We're recapping it a little bit as we wait for our main feed in the Shawn Harrison case, a Reverend Shawn Harrison case out of Massachusetts. We'll talk a little bit more about that case in a minute, but let's talk a little bit more about the Shawn Grate case. So this convicted serial killer, that same jury that convicted him of killing 2 women, as well as abducting and raping a third, had to determine what his punishment would ultimately be, and they said, we recommend the death penalty. Now, what the defense was trying to do was put forward the testimony of Barbara Charter, his sister, and say, look how Shawn grew up. Shawn had a terrible relationship with his mother. He went through a lot of different things. He was a troubled child. Perhaps this is some sympathy in the minds of the jury, and you shouldn't find in favor of the death penalty. I want to bring back in Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. So that was a key moment that was brought up there, where they said, Miss Charter, you're a sister. You've gone through a lot of things he did. You didn't grow up to be a killer, but how then, if that's the case, how can that ever be an effective strategy for the defense? Because if everybody's gone through things and they don't grow up to be killers, then how can the defense ever put that argument forward?
You see, the defense really, they had a struggle that was real, and that is they wanted to get in the information that Shawn Grate's upbringing was horrible or bad or tumultuous, and the best way to do that, the best evidence would be bring in somebody who also grew up in that environment, who could testify from personal knowledge. This is what I saw. This is how my mother treated him, etc. The problem is she's a law-abiding citizen. She grew up in the same environment, and she's okay. She's in a happy marriage. She's well-adjusted. And I didn't mean to chuckle off air, but I kind of did when the prosecution gets up there and says, you know, this, what I just said, you didn't turn out to be a killer. Why not? And she said, I can't just go out and kill somebody. I have responsibilities. So somehow her brain, unlike his, whose brain isn't working right, her brain is working right. And since she grew up in the same environment, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Shawn Grate does not deserve a pass because he had a bad relationship with his mother.
And one of the most compelling aspects of her testimony, Jonna, this is the sister testifying in the death penalty phase of her brother, who is a serial killer. Yeah. Think about all those components of what it's like for her to testify.
And think about that, Jesse. I'm sorry. She loves him enough to get up there and take the stand to try to save his life, knowing that her brother killed 3 or 5 people.
It's putting her in an impossible situation, and it's a really difficult case. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about Shawn Grate, but we're also going to talk about the Reverend Shawn Harrison, a reverend who is on trial for attempting to kill a high school student by shooting him in the back of the head, execution style. We'll be right back. Thank you, Anthony. Recapping a major case that we're going to be covering here on Law and Crime, the Shawn Harrison case. So let's talk a little bit more about it with Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, this is an interesting one. You got a reverend who's on trial for trying to kill a student and saying that this reverend was involved in the illicit drug world. Yeah. What is the defense going with here?
You know, that's a great question, because talk about hiding in plain sight, right? You wouldn't expect a man of the cloth, so to speak, to be a drug runner recruiting young kids from school to do his bidding, right? So that's a great disguise. I think what's most compelling here and what the defense is really going to have to contend with is having the actual victim who survived a bullet to the head, testifying that, yeah, that's the man who shot me. Because if the jury believes him, it's almost like case closed. But I suppose the defense is going to say, it wasn't really him. You didn't identify him initially. You certainly can't tell from that video, Jesse, who's who. Yeah. So that's going to be a little problem for the prosecution, perhaps.
For all of our listeners on SiriusXM Radio, if you look at the video that captures this shooting, because it happened right by an Exxon gas station, it's very hard to tell who's who and what's happening. But you see 2 figures walking along in the snowy area, and it appears to be a shooting, but you just don't know who's who. I would say the defense's strongest argument is he's a reverend. He's a pastor. Are you really going to believe that this guy is a drug dealer and a murderer?
Right.
Or attempted murder?
Could you imagine? It'd be like having a nun for a defendant, right? People just don't want to believe it. But I think there are going to be some other, let's call them prior bad acts for now. I may stand corrected later. Some information is going to come out about this defendant that's going to show he wasn't really squeaky clean. And that may also sway the jury.
I think, in fact, to add to that, I think even before this shooting, the high school where he worked was going to fire him for pushing a female student. So this guy is a very interesting story. We're going to cover it in full here on Law and Crime, so stay tuned on that. But we want to switch gears right now. We're going back to Ohio. We're going to the Midwest. We're going to the Shawn Grate case. We covered this one here on Law and Crime. We covered his trial where he was convicted of killing 2 women, Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley. Also, he was convicted of raping Stacey Stanley. And he was also convicted of abducting and raping multiple times a woman who's only been identified as Jane Doe. Now, that same jury that convicted him also found last week, we covered it here, his sentencing hearing, that they recommend the death penalty for him. And the judge in the case will ultimately have to determine if he will be sentenced to the death penalty. We'll cover that here on Law and Crime. As we recap this case, though, of this serial killer, one of the interesting things is when the defense put forward a witness named Dr. John Fabian, who testified that Shawn Grate suffers from so many different mental disorders. And because of these mental diseases, these mental disorders, basically, you shouldn't find the death penalty here. That he was suffering from so much that he really couldn't control his actions. And therefore, even though he's guilty under the law, maybe he shouldn't be sentenced to the ultimate punishment. What the prosecution did was amazing. In their closing argument, they dissected and broke down and really combated each one of the points of Dr. John Fabian. I'm going to play that for you right now. This is some very good legal work. Take a look. Welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. What you were just listening to and watching was the prosecution's closing argument in the Shawn Grate sentencing hearing. Shawn Grate was convicted of killing 2 women and abducting and raping repeatedly a third. The decomposed bodies of those two women, were found in his home when police arrived. That same jury that convicted him of multiple crimes also convicted him last week, sentenced him last week to the death penalty. They voted in favor of the death penalty. So that was the prosecution's closing argument, trying to explain a little bit why they believe, before the jury ultimately rendered their verdict, why they believe Mr. Grate deserved the death penalty. But let's analyze their closing argument a little bit more. I'm here with Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. What did you make of their closing argument? First thing they did was they attacked the defense's doctor, the doctor that said that Shawn Grate suffered from a lot of different mental diseases. He had a really tough upbringing. How did they attack him? Because I always find that interesting in a courtroom when the attorneys attack an expert witness.
Right. Well, the prosecution did so beautifully, right? He didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to get flippant or sarcastic. He basically said, we have a doctor who was smart and sloppy. That's the exact quote the prosecution used. For a time, he practiced medicine without a license because, remember, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he's not really a doctor. He's a psychologist. He didn't have information that he should have had to make diagnoses pertaining to things that happened in Shawn Grate's life prior to the age of 12. He didn't have information that he needed to make a diagnosis that happened in Shawn Grate's life prior to getting hit in the head with a hammer at 4. So basically what he's trying to convey to the jury is that he's a smart man, but you can only work with the facts that you have, and he didn't have sufficient facts to make a diagnosis. But let's get technical here for a minute, Jesse, because the other thing the prosecution did is sort of dummy down, and I mean that completely respectfully, not disrespectfully, the job of the jury here. And that is they need to find that the aggravating factors outweigh the mitigating factors in order to make a death penalty recommendation, which they obviously did. What does that mean? That means that what the defense's job was to present mitigating evidence, and the prosecution's job was to prevent the aggravating circumstances, and then the jury had to weigh. And what our XM listeners didn't see, but our viewers did, is that the prosecution actually made a very rudimentary scale drawing and tipped the scales in favor of the aggravating circumstances, and obviously the jury agreed with the prosecution's case.
Is this a case about someone having a choice? Like, at the end of the day, is that what this is about? Shawn Grate, he may have had a terrible upbringing. He may suffer from this. He may suffer from that. But if he could make a choice, and he made a deliberate choice to find these women, kidnap them, sexually assault them, kill them, that's on him, right? So in other words, in death penalty sentencing hearings, the only way the defense can win is saying he or she couldn't make a choice. It wasn't up to them.
That could be part of it, if those equate to mitigating circumstances. And listen, Jesse, this wasn't a one-time thing.
I think we actually have to hit our first break.
Gotcha.
We'll be right back, and we'll get right into this. Well, stay tuned, everybody. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering a lot here on the network. Our first case that we're waiting for the Shawn Harrison case out of Massachusetts, a reverend who is on trial for allegedly attempting to murder a high school student, execution style. We'll talk more about that case in a minute, but our focus right now is recapping the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio, a case that we focused heavily on here on the network. It's about this serial killer, this convicted serial killer who was convicted by a jury of his peers of murdering 2 women, Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley, or Stacey Hicks, as well as the abduction and rape of a third woman who's been identified as Jane Doe. The decomposed bodies of these 2 victims were found in the house where Shawn Grate was living in Ohio when Jane Doe, this woman, was able to escape her captor, call 911, and they came and saw this house of horrors that's been described. It's really a disturbing case. The same jury that convicted him then had to decide what his punishment could be. They had to make a recommendation. Would it be life in prison without the possibility of parole? Would it be a certain amount of prison time? Or would it be the death penalty? Well, they came back very shortly after, I think, two and a half hours of deliberations, and they recommended the death penalty for Shawn Grate. What we're doing now is analyzing how they came to that decision. And one of the things that we learned about in the sentencing hearing is we learned more about the defendant. We learned more about Shawn Grate. And he had what has been described as a traumatic childhood, a bad relationship with his mother. He's been described as having suffered from numerous psychological disorders. But at the end of the day, the jury didn't think that was enough. But I want you to listen very carefully right now to the defense's closing argument. Hear how they articulated, in their view, why Mr. Grate was not deserving of the ultimate punishment, the death penalty. This is classic lawyering, ladies and gentlemen, about how a defense team is trying to save their client from death row. Now, it didn't work, but I want you to hear their main arguments right now. Take a look. Welcome back, everybody. This is Jesse Weber, your host here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. You were just listening to the defense's closing arguments in the Shawn Grate sentencing hearing out of Ohio. Shawn Grate is a convicted murderer. He was on trial for the murder of 2 women and the abduction and rape of a third. He was found guilty across the board of 23 separate counts. Then it became his sentencing phase. What would the jury recommend? Life in prison without the possibility of parole, or the death penalty? Well, they came back shortly after only 2.5 hours deliberations, and they recommended the death penalty. What that was the defense's closing arguments before the jury rendered their verdict, and ultimately it didn't sway them. Let's talk about why. I'm here again with Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. What about the defense's closing in your opinion? I hate, second-guessing an attorney and something like that, but there was something missing in your eyes, wasn't there?
There was a lot missing. I went back and forth here. Now, remember, the job of this defense attorney was to give the jurors more mitigating circumstances to overcome the aggravating circumstances. That's the underlying job. And for a while there, he was not doing the defendant any favors when he's basically re-describing how one of these murders actually happened. And when he says things like, she made it easy, she went over there willingly.
Blaming the victim.
Do not even come close to blaming the victim in a case like this, because it will come back to bite you. It's unnecessary. It's unwarranted. I don't think that was a smart phrase. But a couple other things he did that bothered me. One, he said, basically, ladies and gentlemen, life without parole is a death sentence because that means that this man will die in prison. But harken back to what the prosecution said. The prosecution said that Shawn Grate flat out told prosecutors or law enforcement that he's going to continue killing once he's in prison. So now the jurors have to contend with both of those things, and LWOP, the life without parole, or an acronym for it, I think wasn't going to fly with them, and we were correct. The last thing that he did that I really did not like, do not tell the jurors that this decision is on you personally, and you personally, and you personally. Like, as if they're doing something wrong if they come back with a sentence of death. They are not the murderers here. There's one murderer in that room, and it's Shawn Grate. So don't make the jurors feel guilty about whatever their decision may be. I did not like that.
I loved how he said, we'll accept whatever your decision is. I don't think he has a choice.
Right.
They're going to have to accept whatever the decision is. But yeah, there was something interesting about that, especially if you talk about he's going to be going into prison. What's a worse punishment for him? Now, I saw there was an interesting technique trying to explain to the jurors how he'll ultimately die. That's 2 lethal injections after his final meal. Putting that image in the minds of the jurors, that's a strategy, right?
It's a strategy, and I think it's an unfair strategy because he wants the jurors to not be able to with their own conscience, vote for death because they don't want that image. They don't want to feel, when they go home at night and go to sleep for the rest of their lives that they were responsible for ending the life of someone else. And that's exactly what he was trying to do, and that's unfair. Now, fortunately, depending on what side you're on, it did not work. But that's exactly what he was trying to do.
Well, after deliberating for 2 hours, they came back with that recommendation of the death penalty. Whether they'll be able to sleep at night, I don't know. They came back pretty quick on that one. We are going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're covering a lot here on Law and Crime. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. We're looking and listening and watching to a live feed in the Reverend Shawn Harrison case out of Massachusetts. This is about a Boston pastor who's on trial for allegedly attempting to murder a high school student by shooting him in the back of the head, execution style. So this is his police interview right now. This is what the viewers are looking at. So I'm just giving our listeners a little heads up about what the viewers are looking at right now. I want to bring back Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. What a bizarre case this is. As I keep saying, it's like out of Breaking Bad. You have a reverend who's being accused of being a drug dealer, but there's some significant evidence against him right now, Jonna. What have we found?
Well, I think right now what we know is that this reverend isn't exactly squeaky clean. He portrays himself as a good guy trying to help underprivileged youth, but apparently what he's really doing, at least according to the prosecution's theory, is he is recruiting underprivileged kids to help him sell drugs. And in this particular case, the theory is that because this one particular victim was not selling enough weed, he deserved to be dead. So we have this defendant who allegedly shot him in the head. Miraculously, this particular victim survived and testified against him on Friday.
Well, we talk about him not being squeaky clean, but he says he's never been arrested or charged with any crime before this. I mean, there's a popular argument, and I know they make it a lot of times in different trials. My client, who's a certain age, this guy was 55 when he got arrested, is going to start being a illicit drug dealer and start trying to kill high school students at this age. Like, does that surprise you? But then again, you've seen defendants who go on trial for the first time in their 70s, their 80s, right?
I actually have seen that, but usually the prosecution's retort is, this is not this defendant's first crime, it's the first time this defendant got caught. And look, when you hide in plain sight, when you're a man of the cloth, and you use that as a ruse in order to commit these crimes, it could make perfect sense that he has a long history of what we call prior bad acts, but never actually was arrested or convicted of any of those acts.
The victim took the stand a few days ago, right? So the victim took the stand, Luis Rodriguez took the stand, said that Harrison shot him. How much weight does a jury give to the actual victim? Because we talk about so many times on this case, on this trial network, that the victims, unfortunately, are no longer with us. So when you have the victim who survived this shooting, or this alleged shooting, how much weight does the jury give to that?
So it all depends on one thing and one thing only, and that is credibility. Now, look at this. We have a kid. This is a kid on the stand. So I think automatically he's got some built-in credibility, because why would a kid lie about being shot in the head by his, somebody at his school, his mentor? Why would he lie about that? Plus, he's got some sympathy because he's just a child. You wouldn't think that he would be able to make up some extravagant story. So if the jury believes him, that is going to hold a lot of weight in determining whether this defendant is guilty.
It's an interesting case about a reverend who's on trial for attempted murder. We want to go back live into the courtroom right now. So our viewers, they see this. This is the defendant's police interview when he was arrested. All of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, we're about to go live. Let's listen to what the defendant told the investigators when he was first arrested. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so you're listening and watching a live feed in the Reverend Shawn Harrison case. I know the audio is a little tough to hear. I believe a detective's on the stand right now. Reverend Shawn Harrison is on trial for a number of different charges in connection with the attempted murder of a high school student. It's alleged that he tried to kill this student execution style by shooting him in the back of the head, and the student miraculously survived. Luis Rodriguez testified last week about how Harrison tried to shoot him. Now, I want to bring in Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, correct me, if you heard anything about this, I'm curious. He was asked under cross-examination, why didn't you, Mr. Rodriguez, why didn't you first point out Mr. Harrison as your shooter? Why did you wait on it? What did you learn from that?
I mean, there's one logical reason why a kid wouldn't immediately identify this defendant as a shooter. That's because he's scared. He's running. I mean, if you believe him, He's running drugs for this guy who's masquerading as a reverend, who is manipulating at-risk youths at a school. You know, I can understand where he wouldn't want to immediately point the finger for fear that the next time he makes a murder attempt, it's going to be successful. So that's how I would explain that away if I were the prosecution.
And the motive here, although motive is never an element of a crime, you don't need it. It's interesting here because they're saying that Harrison enlisted Rodriguez to help sell marijuana for him, because they're saying Harrison was a drug kingpin. I mean, not a kingpin, but he was involved in the drug trade.
Right.
And that there was a dispute between them about decreased weed sales, wasn't happy how much weed he was selling. Does that sit with you? Would that sit with a jury?
Isn't that terrible? That's like, you know, we're not talking about Girl Scout cookies, right? We're not talking about those kind of sales. We're talking about having a child run drugs. And why do drug kingpins, for lack of a better word, use children to run drugs? Because children tend to get in less trouble if they do get busted. And maybe in this case, you can manipulate a child to not finger the person who's hired him to run his drugs. If you really look at it in that context, it's disgusting. But I wish we could really wish we could hear the police tape, because he sat in there without a lawyer. I didn't see a lawyer making statements to the police. And I think those are going to be pivotal. We're going to find out how big a liar he probably is.
Yeah, this is a bizarre case. We're learning more details about it as it unfolds. Again, we're waiting for the live feed. As soon as we have it, we want to make sure the audio is good. We're going to jump back in. We talked about it earlier that under cross-examination, Rodriguez, the victim, was asked to explain why he didn't tell police, you know, who helped him with the rescues. And he says, it took me a while to get all my thoughts back together after being shot in the head. I was in such denial. I knew who did it, of course. I knew who did it, but it took me such a long time. Now, that could be true, Jonna, that the victim who was shot in the head, I mean, he was just shot in the head. But again, when you have such facts that are so bizarre, a 55-year-old pastor who's on trial for the first time, being accused of being a drug dealer and shooting people in the head, that's a little strange.
You know what, though? This defendant is like a pimp, right? He recruits these young kids, keeps them under control, keeps them under his thumb, and we don't know whether he threatened the kid's family. We don't know exactly how that relationship, what happened during it, when it started, we don't know those facts. But a child is, you can explain away who's shot in the head. You can explain away why he didn't immediately go to the police and say, this guy did. Plus, he could have been afraid he wasn't going to be believed. This is a reverend with a good reputation up until the days before he got arrested for this crime.
I know, pretty amazing stuff. We're going to take a break here on the network. When we come back, hopefully we'll be live in the Shawn Harrison case. And if not, we have so much to discuss about this case as well as others. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering right now the Shawn Harrison case out of Massachusetts, Reverend Shawn Harrison, I should say. That's right, a Boston pastor is on trial for numerous crimes in connection with the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. It's alleged that Harrison tried to shoot him in the back of the head, or did shoot him in the back of the head in an attempt to kill him, execution style. And what's the motive? How did this happen? Well, the prosecution is saying that Reverend Harrison is really a drug dealer. He was involved in the drug trade, enlisted students like Mr. Rodriguez to help sell the drugs. There was a dispute between the two over marijuana sales, and he tried to kill him. We're waiting for our live feed to go back into the courtroom. As soon as we have it, we'll go in. I want to ask Jonna Spilbor, our guest right now, one quick little interesting tidbit about this case. Okay. There was testimony. This is day 3, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. But we saw testimony from the former headmaster at English High School. Now, remember, Reverend Harrison was one of the deans at this high school, and that's how he met Rodriguez. The former headmaster described telling Harrison about the shooting of Rodriguez at school the following day. And according to her, Rodriguez clutched his chest, breathed heavily, and had heart palpitations. I actually thought he was going to have a heart attack. Now, is Mr. Harrison, the defendant, a really good actor, or is this legitimate?
You know, I'm going to go with the actor theory. And here's, not only for obvious reasons, but think about it, though. If you're in a position like that and somebody says, oh, this child was shot, but he survived, now you might get upset, you might want to leave and go to the hospital to be bedside. You might want to do things like that. But to clutch your chest and feign a heart attack just seems like a bit of an overreaction, or just an unbelievable reaction to the news that a student was shot.
Well, it's ultimately up to the jury if they believe it or not. We have a live feed right now in that Shawn Harrison case out of Massachusetts, so let's go live. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody, and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. You're listening and watching to a live feed in the Reverend Shawn Harrison case out of Massachusetts. A reverend, a Boston pastor, who's on trial for multiple crimes, including attempted murder. That's right, attempted murder of a high school student. It's alleged that Mr. Harrison was a drug dealer, that he was living a double life. He enlisted the help of Luis Rodriguez, a high school student, tried to kill him because of decreased weed sales. They can't make this stuff up. That's really what the prosecution's going with. Now, I know our feed isn't great, so I want to analyze a little bit more about this case before we go back. I'm here again with Jonna Spilbor. So if you're going to shoot somebody, why do it in a public street?
Well, I haven't given that much thought, Jesse, because I don't contemplate shooting somebody on a daily basis. But it does look like, I'm certain that nobody realized that they were going to be on camera, because we are on camera pretty much 300 times a day right now in 2018. Wherever you go, you're on camera. It doesn't make sense to do it in public, although I'm sure they weren't planning to be identified. Although the feed for the camera, you can't really tell who's who. I dare say you can't tell if the victim is the actual victim and the perpetrator is this actual defendant. You can't really tell that. But apparently prosecutors know. Prosecutors probably know a little bit more about that than we. But you're right, though. If you put ourselves in the mind of a murderer or attempted murderer, he could have lured that child to a much more remote place and done whatever he was intending to do outside of in his own home, in his backyard, for all I know. So maybe that is going to be another issue for reasonable doubt that the defense is going to bring forth. We're going to have to wait and see. Well,
it's alleged that he lured Mr. Rodriguez out, promised him marijuana, girls, and then it's alleged that he tried to shoot him in the back of the head to kill him. For anybody who's just joining us, first of all, welcome to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Again, I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're going to show you the Shawn Harrison case in its entirety. We're trying to show that. But here's a report right now about this case, summarizing it so you know where we are and where we're going to be in this case. Take a look.
The trial.
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. Thanks for joining us. We're going to go live right now into the Shawn Harrison case out of Massachusetts. We're cutting out of that prior testimony, that prior closing argument in the Shawn Grate case. Reverend Shawn Harrison, a Boston pastor, is on trial for many crimes, including attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez by allegedly shooting him execution style in the back of the head. And why? Because it's alleged that Mr. Harrison, Reverend Harrison, is really a drug dealer, and he hired Mr. Rodriguez to sell drugs for him. They had a dispute about weed sales, and he tried to kill him. Now, before we go back live into that courtroom, I want to thank my guest for today, Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about these cases.
Always a pleasure, Jesse. I'll see you soon.
See you soon. Let's go back live into the Shawn Harrison case.